April 2019. Three rivers in Gifu Prefecture stood as lifeless corridors, stripped of vegetation, suffocating under toxic runoff, and written off as beyond saving. That's when Japanese officials unleashed 50,000 domesticated koi carp into the devastation, prompting lawsuits and global outrage over ecological suicide. Critics warned of immediate disaster. So why did officials stake everything on a plan almost everyone condemned? And what unfolded next defied every expert prediction. Decades of unchecked runoff had turned these rivers into corridors of emptiness. Fields bordering the water released a steady stream of fertilizers and pesticides, feeding a cycle of toxic blooms each summer. By late June, the water shifted from dull brown to a sickly green, thick with algae that thrived on every new pulse of nutrients. Underneath, a dense layer of silt suffocated what little life remained. Oxygen levels at the riverbed hovered near zero. Probes dropped into the mud revealed anoxic depths stretching nearly a meter below the surface. No plants, no invertebrates, only the faint traces of decaying organic matter. Once, these channels had supported thick beds of waterweed and clusters of native lilies. Now, not a single blade of aquatic vegetation broke the surface. The riverbanks, once tangled with reeds and wildflowers, stood bare, their roots long since eroded away. Each rainfall washed more soil into the channels, clouding the water and burying any hope of recovery beneath fresh layers of muck. Fish populations had collapsed years before. The few that survived clung to isolated pools, unable to spawn or find shelter. Even the birds, herons, kingfishers, and egrets had vanished, their food webs erased by the loss of plants and insects. The rivers had become biological deserts. Every sign pointed to a system past the point of return, stripped of the very foundation that once supported life. For officials, the scale of collapse demanded a response that went far beyond the usual measures. Inside the Gifu Prefecture Fisheries Office, the proposal read like a last resort. Officials argued that only a shock to the system could break the rivers out of their downward spiral. They pointed to the evolutionary history of koi carp, descendants of wild common carp that once survived ice ages by thriving in the harshest, most barren waters. If any fish could endure these conditions, it would be koi. The plan called for the release of 50,000 domesticated koi, all sourced from local breeders whose ornamental ponds had become dangerously overcrowded. The fisheries team secured a special permit dated March 28, 2019, bypassing standard stocking protocols under the justification of emergency ecosystem intervention. Opposition was immediate and fierce. The heads of three local fishing cooperatives filed a lawsuit in Gifu District Court, calling the release ecological suicide. Their legal filing warned that koi would outcompete what little native life remained, stirring up toxic silt and unleashing new waves of algae. International environmental groups joined the outcry. A spokesperson from the Asia Conservation Alliance labeled the plan reckless, citing research from Australia and New Zealand where carp introductions had devastated riverine habitats. The critics argued that koi, with their bottom-feeding habits, would only worsen turbidity and accelerate the collapse of already fragile systems. Yet behind closed doors, fisheries officials insisted they had accounted for these risks. They believed that releasing a large enough population at once could tip the balance in favor of recovery, not destruction. Their gamble rested on the idea that the koi's relentless feeding would unlock nutrients trapped in the silt, potentially jump-starting a new food web. With public opinion split and legal challenges mounting, the stage was set for an experiment with no guarantee of success. Within the first 2 months, disaster unfolded along the banks of Gifu's rivers. Nearly a third of the released koi, close to 15,000 fish, perished before summer even reached its peak. Day after day, The current carried pale, bloated bodies onto the mudflats and sandbars. Local newspapers ran front-page photos of the carnage, while television crews broadcast images of dead koi piled up in the shallows, their colors dulled by silt and decay. Reporters grilled fisheries officials, demanding answers for what many described as a wasteful spectacle. "It is a massacre," one headline declared, echoing the outrage of residents and anglers who watched their rivers fill with floating carcasses. Eyewitnesses described the stench drifting over nearby fields, strong enough to force windows shut for days. Biologists dispatched to the scene pulled samples from the water, noting spikes in ammonia and a sudden drop in dissolved oxygen. The causes of death became painfully clear. With no aquatic plants or algae mats to graze on, the koi struggled to find food. Heat waves in May drove water temperatures past 27 degrees Celsius, pushing the fish to their limits. Herons and egrets, sensing easy prey, picked off weakened koi in the shallows. Some survivors thrashed desperately in search of shelter, but found only open water and bare, shifting silt. As the death toll mounted, critics doubled down. Fishing cooperative leaders called for an immediate halt to the experiment, warning that the rivers would become nothing more than graveyards. International conservation groups issued statements condemning the release as reckless and unscientific. The sense of public failure was impossible to ignore. Technicians stationed along the riverbanks watched the surviving koi with growing fascination. At first, these ornamental fish drifted aimlessly, their bright colors standing out against the dull, silt-laden water. But as the weeks passed, the koi began to act less like pampered pond dwellers and more like their wild ancestors. Instead of searching for floating pellets or scraps, they dropped to the bottom, probing deep into the silt with their sensitive barbels. Field observers noted how the koi would sweep their mouths across the riverbed, stirring up clouds of fine sediment with every movement. Some fish dug as much as 15 centimeters into the muck, using powerful head thrusts and rapid suction to uncover anything edible. Tiny worms, insect larvae, even decaying plant fragments buried since before the river's collapse. Trail cameras and underwater microphones picked up the constant rhythmic noise of feeding. The riverbed, once still and silent, now vibrated with activity. Koi foraging left behind small craters and furrows, breaking the hard-packed silt into loose, shifting mounds. Each disturbance sent plumes of sediment drifting into the current, sometimes reducing visibility to near zero for minutes at a time. But technicians tracking water samples noticed something unexpected. Despite the short-term murkiness, overall water clarity began to improve. Measurements taken at fixed points showed a steady drop in suspended solids after the initial feeding frenzy. Researchers suspected that the koi's relentless bottom feeding was doing more than just searching for food. By digging and churning the silt, the fish were releasing nutrients and oxygenating layers that had been locked away for years. Chemical sensors recorded rising oxygen levels just above the riverbed. In places where koi activity was most intense, the silt thinned out, exposing gravel and sand that had not seen daylight in decades. The physical disruption set off a chain reaction, altering the chemistry of the river and making conditions less favorable for the toxic algae that had dominated every summer. For the first time in years, the foundations of a living ecosystem began to reappear beneath the surface. Lab analysts began running round-the-clock tests as the river's appearance began to shift. Turbidity meters, stationed at fixed intervals, captured the changes in real time. In late April, readings hovered near 120 NTU, numbers typical of a waterway thick with suspended silt and algae. By mid-June, those same meters recorded a drop to just under 70 NTU. The data pointed to a 40% improvement in water clarity within 8 weeks, a result that left even the most optimistic fisheries staff stunned. Dr. Mori described the moment the first microbial assays arrived from the field. Water samples collected near the most active koi feeding grounds showed a dramatic increase in aerobic bacteria counts. For years, the silt had been a dead zone, starved of oxygen and dominated by sulfur-loving microbes. Now, with the constant churning by thousands of carp, oxygen penetrated deeper into the sediment. Beneficial bacteria, dormant since the river's collapse, began to multiply. This microbial shift was more than a laboratory curiosity. It meant that the riverbed itself was changing from a chemical sink back into a living substrate. Further analysis revealed another surprise. Algae blooms, which had turned the water toxic green every summer, were suddenly absent. The samples showed a collapse in the dominant blue-green algae species, with nutrients released from the silt but quickly cycled by new microbial activity. The rivers could no longer support runaway blooms. Instead, the water cleared and oxygen levels rose throughout the lower water column. For fisheries officials, the numbers validated a risky hypothesis. The koi's bottom feeding was not just stirring up sediment. It was breaking a chemical deadlock, reintroducing oxygen and life to layers that had been inert for decades. The rivers were no longer static wastelands. They were beginning to breathe again, and the data told the story in numbers as clear as the water itself. In late summer, the riverbeds that had been silent for years began to stir with life. Field crews armed with fine mesh nets and kick sampling trays returned to sites that had yielded nothing but silt for decades. This time, every sweep brought up flashes of movement. Dragonfly nymphs with their armored bodies and grasping jaws clung to bits of gravel. Caddisfly larvae, once thought gone for good, built tiny cases from sand and plant fragments. Most surprising of all were the freshwater shrimp, transparent, quick, and impossible to find in any survey since the late 1990s. Macroinvertebrate taxonomists in Gifu, some of whom had spent their careers documenting decline, now found themselves cataloging a surge in diversity. They identified 3 keystone invertebrates: dragonfly nymphs, caddisfly larvae, and freshwater shrimp as the first to return. Their presence told a story that numbers alone could not capture. Each species filled a vital role. Dragonfly nymphs acted as predators, caddisflies as filter feeders, shrimp as detritus processors. Together, they formed the backbone of a rebuilding food web. Sampling logs from September 2019 showed counts that had not been recorded since the late 1990s. In some reaches, dragonfly nymph densities exceeded 60 individuals per square meter. Field notes captured the excitement. One technician scrawled that it was the first shrimp in 22 years. The return of these invertebrates meant more than just species numbers. They signaled that the rivers could once again support life at every level, setting the stage for even larger changes ahead. By the time spring rains softened the riverbanks in 2020, botanists and field technicians were scanning the water for any hint of green. For years, seed bank surveys had turned up nothing but lifeless silt, no sign that the river's former plant life could ever return. Yet within 3 months of the koi release, something changed. A revival. Shoots of native waterweed and arrowhead began piercing the mud in shallow stretches, first as scattered blades, then as dense mats. Botanists traced their origins to seeds buried deep in the riverbed, locked away since the last healthy season decades earlier. The koi's relentless digging had exposed these dormant seeds to light and oxygen, breaking the cycle of stagnation. By early summer, Aquatic vegetation blanketed nearly 30% of the riverbed, near the most active koi populations, stabilizing loose silt and creating pockets of shelter for small animals. Juvenile fish monitors soon recorded another milestone. In the backwaters and slow eddies, clouds of koi fingerlings, each only a few centimeters long, darted among the new growth. These were not survivors from the original release, but the first generation born in the wild. Their presence signaled that the river could now support breeding populations, with enough food and cover to protect them from predators. Botanists documented how the recovering plant beds slowed erosion, filtered runoff, and provided spawning grounds for invertebrates and fish alike. The riverbed, once a barren expanse, now offered structure at every level, from tangled roots to swaying stems. Habitat was returning, not through human planting or engineering, but through the combined actions of fish and the long dormant seeds they had stirred awake. Ayu sweetfish, once thought lost to memory in these rivers, returned in the spring of 2022. Fisheries surveys recorded their silvery bodies darting through stretches that had been barren for decades. Along the banks, bird life surged back in tandem. Great egrets, gray herons, and kingfishers lined the shallows, feasting on the new abundance. The rivers, silent for years, now echoed with the calls of returning wildlife. Local fishers, some with 40 years on these waters, described the sight of ayu spawning runs as a promise fulfilled. For them, the return of the sweetfish was more than ecological, it was a cultural revival. Biodiversity surveys confirmed the change. 47 distinct species documented, up from just 11 before the koi release. Each new arrival signaled a rebuilt food web, a river system once again teeming with life from the silt to the sky. Restoration budgets for these rivers had always been staggering. Traditional engineering such as dredging, planting, and chemical treatments came with a 30-year price tag of $300 million. The koi release, by contrast, cost just $12 million. 5 years later, the rivers were not only alive again, they were profitable. Independent economists valued the ecosystem services at $70 million annually, factoring in water purification, flood control, and new tourism. A local cafe owner, whose business sits beside the now clear water, described the change as an investment that paid for itself and then some. The government's own accounting methods reclassified the rivers from impaired to healthy, unlocking new funding streams and lowering maintenance costs. As word spread, international agencies began to study the numbers, searching for lessons that could be applied far beyond Japan's borders. In early 2023, South Korea's Ministry of Environment launched a pilot in Seoul, releasing domesticated koi into 2 stretches of the Jungnangxian, a river long written off as ecologically dead. Policy memos from the project cited the Gifu data as a model for rapid recovery, despite skepticism from local biologists who were wary of carp's invasive reputation. That same spring, Taiwan's Council of Agriculture funded a feasibility study in the Qianan Plain, targeting canals drained of life by decades of pesticide use. Researchers there tracked sediment chemistry and invertebrate counts, hoping to replicate the cascading effects seen in Japan. Across Europe, a consortium of river scientists drew up proposals to test native carp in post-industrial waterways, and the European Commission earmarked funds for preliminary trials. Each project weighed the risk and the rewards, debating whether engineered bioturbation could succeed where traditional restoration had failed. Today, river restoration faces a crossroads: engineered intervention or letting nature's survivors rewrite the rules. As governments worldwide study Japan's results, one fact stands out: nature's resilience often eclipses our imagination. The future of degraded waterways may depend less on human control and more on understanding which species can spark recovery. Sometimes, the boldest solutions swim just beneath the surface. Share your thoughts on rewilding below.